It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you, and I'm honored for all the kind words. This is a very exciting time for crypto, I think for crypto in Korea, and I think this is an extraordinary event, an opportunity, and I'm extremely excited to be here. I wanted to share with you a little bit of how I personally experienced this and got into this area, and I'm asked to give you a little bit of a flavor for the history, so I apologize, but I'd like to ask you to imagine back 35 and a half years ago. It's a long time. And I was a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley, at that time. And my classmates included people you might have heard of in the tech community, like Eric Schmidt, my office mate, and Bill Joy, who was around the corner, but we had the same advisor for a lot of the time. And I was interested in cryptography, of course, and I saw its potential to allow people to protect their own privacy. Back then, privacy was a big deal. It's quite different now. It's still important, but we had a lot more of it back then. And this was a key thing to me, but it was just a part of the picture because it's also a fact that cryptography is the only way for individuals to really protect themselves in cyberspace, in the digital world that we all saw coming in those days. So when I read in Science magazine, as a graduate student, that the National Security Agency of the United States government was trying to stop all public research in cryptography, I was quite disturbed about this. You can imagine Berkeley is the place where the free speech movement occurred, and this is the atmosphere there, and this was a very disturbing concept. So one of the key things they were doing was threatening large organizations of scientists and technology people and to try to get them to cancel sessions or conferences on the field of cryptography. And so what I did was, I think what any sort of self-respecting Berkeley graduate student at that time would do, and I just went down to the little print store on Telegraph Avenue that had published the Berkeley Free Press during the free speech movement, and I gave them a one-page announcement of a little conference that I wanted to have about cryptography at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I gave them we had mailing labels which I got from various people, and my girlfriend and I actually sat in our apartment and put the invitations into the envelopes and mailed them, and it was done, and there was no one that could stop us. And I went there. It was a very good attendance, quite a high percentage of people who we invited appeared there, about I think there were about 80 plus scientists in the room there. And as the general chairman, we had Ron Rivest and Alan Sherman were the co-program chairs, and I was the general chairman. So I got to make the opening remarks like Ash just did, and I thanked everyone for coming. And in the front row were all the people from the National Security Agency, but they didn't say that in those days. They just listed their address as Maryland, and things like that. And they were all there. And so I got up in front of them and I thanked everyone. And I said, by paying your $100 in those days registration fee for attending this conference, you have become a member of the International Association for Cryptologic Research. And this was a new organization that I announced, and they were members, whether they liked it or not. And we were going to have another conference in the spring in Udine, in Italy, and we had officers and a board of directors, and we were incorporated. We were in an international organization. This is something that's very hard to stop because there's a lot of United Nations protections and so on. So the International Association for Cryptologic Research remains an independent entity that sponsors the major conferences in cryptography every year. So we have 3 flagship conferences every year, one that's still in that same place in Santa Barbara, one that moves around Asia generally, and one that moves around Europe. We publish a journal, the Journal of Cryptology. Springer Verlag is the publisher. We have half a dozen other events that, and workshops and so on, and an e-print. And this is the only and a very robust force for bringing cryptographers together, allowing them to publish their work, get academic recognition, which of course is key in academia. And so this was a very important act that, well, I guess I had to do it. I did something else in 1982. And that was actually right there in Santa Barbara. I presented a small paper at the conference because I wasn't the program chair, so I could submit a paper and have it accepted and present it. And so my paper was about okay. Well, we'll just, I think if I maybe push this button here, it will, no. Well, fortunately, I remember what my paper was about. In fact, it was about something very relevant here. It was about electronic money. And it was called, there we go. I think. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, it was called Privacy Protected Payments, and it appeared in the proceedings of the conference, and it introduced this notion of a blind signature, which protects privacy, and I will explain it to you in a moment. But of course, it's also worth remembering that this was also the introduction of the idea of a number that is worth money, what I called a digital bearer instrument. If you had the number, then you had the money. This was a radically new idea in those days. And I introduced it in this elaborate form of blind signatures in order to give it a special privacy feature. And I'd like to explain to you really briefly how the blind signature works. It's more or less quite simple. And then talk about the privacy, and then we'll talk about the company that I founded and pushed forward to bring this to the market 12 years later. So the idea of a blind signature is, for electronic payments, is that a person would have an account at a bank, and they would be known to the bank under their identity 762, say their account number, and they would have a certain balance in the account, and conceptually they would take a piece of paper and a piece of, this is 35 years ago, we had something called carbon paper. I don't know how many of you remember that, but it's a kind of paper that if you write on it, it transfers black to the paper on the other side. So you put a piece of paper, a piece of carbon paper in an envelope, and you give it to the bank. The bank takes, say, $1 from your account, and they put a stamp on the outside of the envelope. And that's their official stamp, which no one can forge. But the carbon paper makes that stamp transfer onto the piece of paper inside the envelope, as you can see below. So later, when you open the envelope and throw it away, when you take that piece of paper with the bank's mark on it to a retailer, they can see that it was validated by the bank. It must be worth $1. However, they cannot know which account it was withdrawn from because of the blind signature. And so they would send it into the bank to get $1 credited to their account, and similarly, the bank has no way of knowing who withdrew that money originally. So this is the privacy feature. There's also the notion of double spending, which you've heard a lot about these days. Of course, that was a part of this. I had to solve the double spending problem. So I guess I posed that problem and solved it by the bank having a database and making sure that it wouldn't accept these payments more than once. And there's some tricks you can use to make it pretty secure against the bank lying about that, trying to cheat. But the other thing, though, that you might not notice is that, of course, the person who, the account holder could write a number on that piece of paper. And so later, they can tell the world who they paid, and the bank can validate that. So the privacy protects the person, but the person can always later identify who it was that received the money. This is an asymmetry. It's what I called at the time one-way privacy, or sometimes payer anonymity, if you will. This is a really interesting thing, which I think a lot of people have lost sight of these days, because, back then and still, the criminal use of payment systems can be defined as, and it was then officially defined by the Bank for International Settlement, whatever you may think of them these days. They said it was the use of payments for extortion, bribery, or black markets. And it makes perfect sense. Those are all schemes where the untraceability of the payments is a big problem for society. Well, it's really interesting to notice that these blind signatures make this kind of money, which we later called eCash, unsuitable, useless for criminal use of payments. Because, what kidnapper would accept payment by check? What politician would accept a bribe by wire transfer? So what black market seller would accept a Visa credit card payment? The person receiving the money in all those scenarios does not want to be in a position where they could be irrefutably identified by the payer. And yet, the payer's privacy is always protected, as you would want as a consumer. You don't want people to know where you're shopping, what you're doing. That's the personal privacy aspect. So we could achieve this with blind signatures. Some other interesting stuff happened in 1982, which I think you'll be hearing about soon, but I'm not going to go into it now. But it's particularly relevant. If we then fast forward to 1994, so we had the first World Wide Web conference. It was in Geneva, where the World Wide Web was invented. There was a keynote speech. There were two. Mine, it's just like here. There's a first keynote and a second keynote. Mine was the first keynote. Tim Berners-Lee was the second keynote. During that keynote, what I did was I made an eCash payment, the first international eCash payment from Geneva to Amsterdam, live on stage. And I wrote a little press release, which was a couple of paragraphs, I think. I was sitting out on the patio at the cafeteria they had for the employees at CERN. And all of a sudden, that press release was picked up on by all kinds of media, and it was a huge, that was the beginning of DigiCash. Really, we had so much, there was so much interest in what we were doing all over the world, and, the technology, here's a historic slide. You won't find this information online yet, but I have quite a lot of memorabilia in a big vault, and this is a little bit of it. These are screen captures of some of the actual clients that we had in those days. Maybe brings back memories for some of you. So this is how the eCash worked, and here's some other memorabilia. So this was the original core of the team. There's another person. Yelta wasn't in this photo. Later, we had 40 and more developers, tons of developers. If you go to my website, you'll see all of these, so you can click and see all the press releases and all the details behind this. And even you can click on those logos up there in the upper right. Those were some of the merchants who originally accepted the eCash, which we issued. This was called Cyberbucks. So we just said, okay, we're going to issue this much, and if you sign up, we're going to send it to you. And all these merchants stepped up to the plate and offered things for sale in Cyberbucks currency. And you have to remember that, this was before electronic commerce. This was very, very early days. It was difficult to do all of these things. And yet we had a good deal of support and interest. And Then we also licensed the software to banks, and several banks began issuing eCash as a fiat currency denominated form. So we had the Cyberbucks, which was our own money that we created, and then, for example, Deutsche Bank, which was the largest bank in Europe at the time, issued Deutschmark in those days. Remember this denominated eCash, for example, and we had issuers in Australia, as you can see, and in the United States, Mark Twain Bank. We also had a number of other issuers around the world, and Nomura, for example, licensed the technology, and so forth. So we were doing a great job of creating a global use of this technology, and this is all while I was running the company, just kind of as a scientist, although I taught at a business school a little bit, so I had some exposure. My favorite class at Berkeley, actually, was entrepreneurship. And that was every Wednesday night you could go and a different entrepreneur would come and tell their story. And I took that class 3 times in a row because they always had different speakers, and I just loved that class. And I ended up being on the faculty at New York University Graduate School of Business and also at the undergraduate school. But really, the reason I pushed, and this is not, I'm announcing that this here, that's a little bit late, but I haven't really pointed this out publicly, but why did I, as a scientist really, because I was doing a lot of other scientific stuff in the meantime here, why did I push eCash out into the world in those days? I felt it was very important to do so because what I hoped is that the public would come to understand and expect an ability to protect their own privacy using cryptography. And I thought if once you plant that meme or that seed of an idea, that it would grow. And I had a whole program for other kinds of electronic transactions, including communication and credentials and so on, involving consumers, where I showed that privacy could also be protected unconditionally in a similar way. This appeared on the cover of Communications of the ACM, which was, in those days, the holy grail of academic publication venues in computer science. It also appeared in Scientific American. You can see the article on my website, and that was that had, I think, 10 different languages around the world. So I really worked hard to push these ideas forward for those reasons. And you might ask, just let me wrap up here. Well, so what have I been doing in the meantime? Or what happened? What's next? Well, I have been working on some new ideas, and I think there will be some important announcements coming up. One of the things I'm really interested in and concerned about and I think I can make a big difference in potentially by introducing new ideas is the area of allowing individuals to have more control over cryptocurrencies and to reap some of the benefits no matter where they live and how much dough they have to begin with. And also in governance and how to distribute governance not only of cryptocurrencies, but of other things in a way that's more direct and somehow dramatically new, but also harkens back to the ancient Greeks, where direct democracy was used to create most of Western civilization in a brief 140-year period, as you may know. So anyways, I'm going to be here for the whole conference, and I'm very excited to learn more. This is a great program. Jeff and Nesh and I think Josh also put together. It's fabulous. So I want to thank you all for your attention and welcome here.